Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from. I'm Nishan Sharma, visiting researcher at the Institute of Chinese Studies, and I welcome you all to another edition of ICS Wednesday seminar. Today, we are hosting a panel discussion which is titled China US Relations, Down Balloon, Cancelled Visit, Is It a Lost Opportunity? This is a special one, a very topical issue, and an illustrious set of experts are here on the panel today. We are honored to have Professor Dawei, Ms. Shannon Tiezzi, and Professor Alka Acharya as panelists today. Our first speaker is Ms. Shannon Tiezzi, who is the editor-in-chief at the Diplomat. Our second speaker is Professor Dawei, director of the Center of International Security and Strategy and professor of the Department of International Relations, School of Social Sciences, Tsinghua University. Our third speaker is Professor Alka Acharya, honorary director of the ICS and chairperson at the Center for East Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Moderating this panel is Professor Hemant Adlakha, Vice Chairperson, Honorary Fellow of ICS, and Professor at the Center for Chinese and Southeast Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. The panel will be discussing what is being called the Balloon Gate incident. Anyone who is not living under a rock would know that a Chinese balloon was shot down by the United States on Feb 5. There was an initial apology by the Chinese side calling it a strayed weather balloon. Many in the US insisted that it was a spy balloon. Amidst this kerfuffle, the ultimate fallout was the cancellation of US Secretary of State Antony Blinken's visit to China. There is a lot to unpack, and amongst other things, this panel will deliberate upon 5 important questions. First, has the storm over the balloon robbed Washington and Beijing of an opportunity? Second, if this is really the beginning of a new Cold War, and what are the security implications in the Indo-Pacific? Third, does an intensification of US-China competition indicate that China could queer India's G20 presidency this year? Fourth, is the balloon row really the spectacle that Biden administration will use to push its stuttering election cart? Last but not the least, what does one make of the fact that China figured at least 5 times in Biden's State of the Union address? Now, before I invite Professor Adlakha to begin the proceedings, let me lay out a few housekeeping rules. All the participants except the speakers will be muted for the duration of the event. Participants are requested to send in their queries via the chat box or use the raise hand option. Please unmute yourself only when called upon to do so by the chair. I now hand over the floor to Professor Adlakha. Please, sir.
Thank you, Nishant. Since the introduction has been done and the guest speakers and the participants have been welcomed, so I will go straight to the point, and I'll begin with 2 clarifications. The first one is that I'm not a professor, I'm associate professor and professor of Chinese. And second, I'm also doubling up as a moderator and also speaker in this panel discussion. So in addition to the concept note and what Nishant has summed up before us about the topic, the series of questions which have been flagged in the concept note, I will use this opportunity in the time allotted to me to share with you a few more observations. And the first one is that there is no doubt that the growing chasm between the US and China in the past few years is now sliding into not a Cold War, but towards a hot war. Second, following the Bali G20 summit, where Biden and Xi held their first one-to-one in-person meeting, and particularly over the last 2 months, the US administration has massively intensified its conflict with China. For example, in December end last year, a bill was passed to directly arm Taiwan. Then in January this year, that is not last month, we are on the 1st of March now. In January this year, the Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the US and the CCP was constituted, which held its first meeting yesterday. And last Thursday, the US announced it will quadruple the number of US forces stationed on Taiwan, which at least some analysts in Beijing view as the end of the US One China policy. Now, for the US casus belli list to justify the war drive against China is only expanding and expanding fast. I mean, for example, while the hot air balloon air is yet to cool down, the US media and the Department of Energy have begun to revive the COVID-19 Wuhan lab leak theory, which was the main story or one of the main stories in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, based on the statements issued by the Department of Energy. Now, this is the same thing, actually, some critics are saying, without any iota of evidence. It's just like what happened in 2003 in the Second Iraq War, where there was no evidence later on, as it was found out, of the weapons WMD, weapons of mass destruction. Then the last but not least, an astonishing new development which has either gone unnoticed or has been accepted as a normal thing is the change in the language of the US administration in general and the US House Select Committee on China in particular. I mean, as some of you might know, this House Committee had its meeting yesterday, and it is very interesting. You look at even the title of this committee or the nomenclature in which it is called. It is called the Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. And I remember Alka had written a piece after the 19th Party Congress, which was titled that not Xi Jinping, let us focus on China. And now today, if we look at the discourse coming out from America, it's neither China nor Xi Jinping. It is actually the Communist Party of China. And so the House Select Committee chairperson, for example, Senator Gallagher, said during the hearing last night that the Communist Party of China laughed at our naivete while they took advantage of our good faith. But the era of wishful thinking is over. The House Select Committee will not allow the Communist Party of China to lull us into complacency or maneuver us into submission. Now, isn't it funny? The most powerful nation in the world is talking of facing existential threat from a lesser military power, which is under Communist Party control, and is talking of forced submission to that lesser military power. I mean, like some Chinese I've seen in on the WeChat and also some commentaries in China, they're actually laughing over it, and they're saying that, is it the case of the mouse terrifying the elephant? I think I'll stop here and then request Shannon to begin her 7 minutes.
Thank you. And thank you very much for inviting me. It's always a privilege to join conversations outside of Washington, D.C., because there tends to be a sort of common wisdom that just gets accepted in D.C., and it's very refreshing to go to places where that is not the case and where we can have broader conversations. So I want to talk a little bit about domestic politics in the United States and how that factored into this balloon gate incident. My general reading is that the Biden administration was initially trying to keep this quiet, to try to salvage Blinken's upcoming visit to China. But domestic political factors, they felt forced for electoral reasons to accelerate their response. And then China felt forced to do the same, and now we are where we are. So we can start first by looking at the timeline. So the balloon was actually first tracked entering US airspace over Alaska on January 28th. It's very notable that the Pentagon did not say anything about it until it became public knowledge. The public discussion, the press briefing from the Pentagon came after images from US citizens on the ground in Montana. And it's no coincidence that that's the order that this happened in. People were literally looking up and saying, what the heck is that thing? There's people are taking pictures of it. They're discussing, possible theories about what it could be, including UFOs. So the Pentagon, I think, felt that they needed to reassure the American public that your government knows about the balloon. We know where it came from, and we're handling the situation. So they had a press briefing, saying that this is a balloon. We've been tracking it. We believe it is a Chinese surveillance balloon, but we also believe that it is not gathering any, meaningful intelligence, really. So we don't need to take any action at this point. Of course, that caused a huge backlash in the United States, particularly from Republicans. There was a lot of criticism of the Biden administration for having let the balloon travel so far into US airspace, a lot of demands for them to shoot it down immediately, which I think would have been a terrible idea for any number of reasons, not least being the Pentagon had been repeatedly saying it could not do so without the risk of harming civilians on the ground. So actual American people. But it's very easy when you're not the person in the decision-making position to criticize and to say, well, you should have been tougher. So that pressure meant that the Biden administration felt it had no choice but to shoot the balloon down once it became safe to do so. So as we all know, it culminated in the successful downing of the balloon on February 4th, US time, which was really, I think, an attempt to placate the domestic criticism, to say, no, look, we did shoot the balloon down. Everyone stop yelling at us for not doing that earlier. And then I think the leaks about this being part of a wider program, which I think were incredibly embarrassing to Beijing, those are also an attempt to provide domestic political cover by the Biden administration, especially the pointed comments that balloons from China had overflown the United States at least 4 times before, including during the Trump administration, which is a really crucial point from the political point of view in the United States. This was designed to counteract pressure on the Biden administration for not doing enough. The implication is like, well, maybe we didn't shoot it down immediately, but we did more than all those other guys in the past because they just didn't do anything and we never heard about it. What's really interesting to me is that since the leak and since Blinken's canceled visit, there have actually been a number of high-profile leaks, anonymously sourced comments that to me convey the Biden administration is actually trying to tamp down the tensions with China over this incident. First, CNN reported that the US intelligence community believes Xi Jinping didn't have personal knowledge of the balloon. Now, essentially, this is an attempt to absolve China's top leadership of any blame for the incident. It gives a bit of plausible deniability that, Xi Jinping didn't know what was going on. The foreign ministry didn't know what was going on. We can still engage with them. Then second, the Washington Post received a fairly extensive briefing on the balloon's flight path. According to the US government, it took off from Hainan Island and was traveling as it would normally, with prevailing wind patterns, have traveled over Guam and potentially Hawaii. But there was a very unexpected cold front at that time that pushed the balloon sharply north. The direct quote from a US official was, "It took an unexpected northern turn due to abnormal weather patterns," which, if you're paying attention, essentially confirmed part of China's official account, which was, of course, that this balloon was blown off course. Now, obviously, China says that this is not a surveillance balloon, it's just a weather balloon. And the United States, I will tell you, no one in the US really believes that story. So that's another issue we can talk about later. But I think China kind of followed the opposite path. It initially offered a fairly conciliatory response, acknowledging, yes, this balloon is from China. Of course, no country is going to admit that it's been caught in a surveillance operation. So it offered this cover story that it was a weather balloon. But as the domestic political factors in the United States pushed the United States towards a more bellicose response, I think China felt it had to change its tone of response as well, particularly once the US downed the balloon. I think Beijing felt a lot of pressure to suddenly change its response as well. So now you have China suddenly going on the attack and having very strong remarks about the US should not have shot this balloon down, there will be consequences. So both countries got caught in this action-reaction cycle of not wanting to be outmaneuvered, not wanting to look weak. And I think that is, in a nutshell, where the US-China relationship stands. Even though there's political will on both sides, an unexpected incident like this can completely drive things off the rails because there's not trust. And neither side wants to look like the party that got taken advantage of. So I will leave off there, and I look forward to continuing the discussion in the Q&A.
Thank you, Shannon. That was really something to carry the debate forward, and I'm sure that there will be many, many questions to you to elaborate more on the domestic debates in particular. Now, let me turn to Professor Dawei. Professor Dawei, of course, I mean, a great intriguing point here is that, as Shannon also mentioned, based on some reports in the US media, that whether President Xi Jinping was aware or unaware of the balloon. Maybe, I don't know how easy is it for you to, while being in Beijing, to tell us more, as we already know or don't know anything about Xi Jinping being aware or not aware. And in addition to that, I mean, there is a growing feeling that other than the balloon saga, the series of actions on the part of the US administration in the recent months have made it very clear to at least a lot of analysts in Beijing that China must now go without hoping of any kind of reversal or reconciliation with the US hostile attitude. So on these and many other issues, please, the floor is yours. Professor Dawei.
Yes, thank you, Professor Alka, and thank ICS for having me for this challenging and interesting event. And I agree with what Hammond and Shannon said just minutes ago about the whole the process of the incident or the timeline. And I of course I'm obviously I'm not at a position to give you more information because I really don't know more information on this incident. But I of course we all know the position of Chinese government. I won't repeat that, but I personally I don't know if it's a surveillance balloon or not. But even if it's a surveillance balloon, I think it's still legal so long as it did not enter the airspace of the United States. Well, I really don't believe that's Chinese side's intention to enter the airspace of the US. Obviously, it's too risky. And the US side, basically, I think some of my American friends said that that balloon or aircraft can be steered. So it's something very sophisticated. I don't know, I'm not an expert on balloon, but if we can control that balloon, let's imagine if we can control a balloon which was found in Montana in the Midwest of the United States. If it can be steered, I must steer it towards the Pacific to let it leave the U.S. territory or airspace as soon as possible. Why should China steer it eastward and southward, and until it be hit in South Carolina, let it show to cross the whole country? I think it's not reasonable. So basically, no matter it's civilian or it's military used aircraft or balloon, I think China lost the control over it. So that's an accident. I believe that, no matter it's military or civilian usage. So if it's an accident, I do think the U.S. side maybe overreact to that, and I agree with Shannon that after that, China side, I think, overreact to Americans' overreaction. So that's a vicious cycle. And I think that told us two things. First thing is how low the trust between the two sides is, and how easy it can be politicized, right? Any accident that nobody want to see can become a major national headlines, maybe in the US and actually 1 year ago when then Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, I personally do believe that the executive branch didn't want her to visit, but it still became the headline of the Chinese media, and the whole country followed that news. So that incident, that case, the Nancy Pelosi's visit and this balloon issue, I think politicized very much in two countries and make ordinary people, no matter in Chinese or in China or in the US, feel kind of hostile to the other side. Another thing we learned from this accident is we lack the effective crisis management measures between the two countries. So after this accident broke out, we didn't have enough effective channel to communicate and try to low down the temperature, to cool down the temperature. We didn't have that channel, and even when the Secretary of Defense of the U.S. tried to call his Chinese counterpart, our side rejected. So this could be very dangerous. The two countries, we don't trust each other, and we don't have crisis management mechanism between the two countries. I think any small incident or accident could evolve into a big one. The second thing I want to say is how to evaluate the influence of this incident. As our question listed, the first question, actually, I think the opportunity we used to have before this canceled visit and the aircraft or balloon issue was not an opportunity for rapprochement. I think it's merely an opportunity for stability, for more stable relationship between China and the US, or a manageable competition. We cannot change that strategic competition between the two countries, but what the two sides tried to do was try to set a flaw in this competition, and to prevent it be, to prevent some major crisis or even a military conflict. So this competition, strategic competition, or this even sometimes confrontation from our perspective is a structural issue. It's caused by the narrowing gap of the two countries' power, and also the divergent development strategy of the two countries. So, and of course, it's being accelerated by the war in Ukraine. So, I think, of course, this balloon issue is a big, news, but I don't think we should exaggerate that accident, because it's really an accident, and it's not a structural issue. So I don't think it is as important as incidents like Ukraine war or trade war. It's slowly, I think it's getting cooler and cooler. But of course, we may face other challenges in coming months, like the senior official or congressman's visit to Taiwan, and the U.S. media also reported that Chinese leader will visit Russia, and those issues, and also the U.S. media reported that Chinese company provide aids to Russia. Those issues, I'm not saying it's true, of course, I don't know, but I mean, those development could cause further disruption to the coming months. But I still believe we still have a narrowed window of opportunity, or window for stability maybe in the middle of this year, or maybe in the fall, before the G20 and before the APEC, which will be held in India and in the United States. So I still cross my finger, but it's much more difficult than 2 months ago, of course. But I think there is still some hope to stabilize the situation, rather than rapprochement or detente. I think that's something we cannot achieve right now. Okay, I will stop here, and we can discuss more in the Q&A session. Thank you, Hammond.
Okay, thank you, Professor Dawei. I mean, I take it that you were very clear in telling us that you don't see this as anything to do with any structural conflict or contradiction between the two countries, as Shannon also had earlier indicated, that China's quick admittance was perhaps indicative of not trying to or not willing to escalate the issue, as you also said that this is just an accident and it should have been best left at that. So Alka, your response, please.
Okay, thank you. In 7 minutes, I guess I'll just try to address a few things from this larger context of where are US-China relations headed. Let me start with a slightly provocative kind of a formulation that if this balloon incident had not happened, it may have been perhaps necessary to invent one. And the reason I say this is because around the time Blinken's visit was announced, if we recall, on the Chinese side, there was no announcement that a visit was to take place. And it was clear that the two sides were hard at work to put an agenda together which could have produced some outcomes from the visit. And it didn't seem like they were getting any success in that. And the kind of writings that appear around that time are basically projecting two perspectives. One perspective was that Blinken's visit was coming at a time when there had been some kind of momentum within the United States and within China to improve the relationship. And after Biden's meeting with Xi Jinping in November, it was, the whole suggestion was that that they needed to keep the lines of communication open, that we needed to increase dialogue. And it was that spirit with which this idea that there was a momentum to take this relationship away from those controversial kind of waters and provide some kind of a stability. And in that context, it was being mentioned that, well, okay, so what is Blinken going to do? Will he set the guardrails so that the relationship doesn't fall off the track? Will he set limits to the kind of red areas that the relationship should not strain to, will they have some agreement that they will avoid collision and war? So these were the kind of issues that were coming up. But of course, the agenda was huge because there was this ongoing trade war, Taiwan, the technological now war that is on between, as in the case of the chips, and of course the North Korea and human rights. All these things were there, and of course, above all, Ukraine. And so while on the one hand, we had this idea about momentum to improve, but very, very problematic issues. And on the other hand, that the movement to decouple the relationship since the trade war had also been going on very strongly. So in other words, there were these two contrary trends, that the United States was not at all keen to continue to give China the opportunities which they felt the Chinese had benefited from unduly, and that they would keep pushing with the decoupling, despite the costs that would be incurred. And so there were these two contrary trends. And in one sense, some post-balloon commentaries seem to suggest that, well, both sides were relieved that, okay, they didn't have to have a visit which would not produce any outcomes. So the point I'm trying to make is not that there is no sense that the dialogue has to go on, that lines of communication have to be open, that stabilization. But I think more than the very substantial bilateral issues of trade, it's now the Ukraine factor that is weighing down much more heavily on this. And the Americans are really not too sure how the Chinese are going to weigh in on this. And so there is one set of factors, and I think Shannon can give us some more elucidation on this. One set of forces which believe that the Chinese have to be pressured and given very clear message that they cannot possibly enter this on the Russian side. And as has been pointed out, that it is now becoming embroiled, the China factor is becoming embroiled in the US domestic politics because of the forthcoming elections. So quite apart from the fact that, yes, there is a structural transformation that is underway, the bilateral issue is increasingly going towards, and I'll take Hemant's point that he mentioned right at the beginning, that are we therefore looking not at the attempts to stabilize, but attempts to take it in the direction of hot war? I mean, the manner in which the Taiwan issue is becoming more and more inflamed and more visits are being announced, and rather than having visits to each other's countries, they are bringing this Taiwan aspect in. So it seems to me that at this point, other than Biden's broad commitment to dialogue, we don't see we don't see a determined push. There are some interest groups which are pushing for dialogue, which are pushing for visits. But on the whole, I think Biden is now under tremendous pressure to put up this front, or to put up a very strong kind of that I can take care of the Chinese, I will take care of our national security, our sovereignty will not be. And this is increasingly, it's rather ironical that at this point, the Speaker of the House is now another McCarthy. And I think the shades of the ideological conflict are very amply reflected in the fact that it's the Communist Party that now becomes. So the threat perception within the United States is a combination of both the red menace once again, and that they are going to now spy after having put them through all that economic. And so I think the entire projection is reflective of a certain kind of a mindset. And the Chinese, on the other hand, are not making things easier. And the final point that I will conclude with is that it's rather strange that Professor Dawei's point that, the fact that the mechanisms for communication or measures for management channels of communication, that these are not working. And the the fact is that there are at least 3 major hotlines between the United States and China. Now, if all the 3 hotlines are not working, that points to the political kind of a position that we see between them. And it's not just on one side. The Americans tried to get in touch with them, but the Chinese refused. And is it only the pressures of the incident that is putting this, or something else? So I therefore would conclude by saying that China is now going to become embroiled in the domestic politics of the United States in a way that will keep constricting the options for a way out. There may continue to be some attempt at dialogue, but I think a real breakthrough can be expected only after the elections are over. Thank you.
Thank you, Alka. And that was really as provocative as you began with, and especially the 2 points which you made that drew my attention. You mentioned about something about decoupling, and that reminded me that actually, if you look at the language and the content of the Biden administration, especially on decoupling also, it's actually not only justifying, but it is further consolidating the discourse and the language during the Trump administration, especially when it comes to decoupling. I mean, that I've read some of the debates in America, and where some people are actually now saying not just for domestic issues, but also for the China issue, that Biden is the best Republican president America could have. You know, so with these, I think we'll enter into the second round, where the panelists are free to ask questions to each other. I mean, I have one question for each panelist, but I will hold on to that and invite other panelists to ask each other questions to make it more interesting. Yes, Alka, go ahead.
So my first question to Shannon, because I found her insights into the American dynamics very interesting. So Shannon, taking from where you left off, my follow-up question, and which comes out of some of the concerns that I have raised, where is the ball now? In whose court is the ball? Because we are now caught up in a situation. So what will give? I'll just leave it at that, and my second question will come later.
Yeah, I think this kind of gets to the heart of the problem, because I think both sides think the ball is in the other side's court. You often hear China saying outright that the other party has a responsibility to mend ties. The US doesn't say that outright, but I think sometimes the implication is clear. So I think that's the issue, right? Is where the ball is depends on who you are and what your perspective is. So I think China would like to see some sort of show of, regret, at least. They're not going to get an apology for shooting down the balloon, but some indication that, we regret that it had to come to that from the US side. Whereas I think the US, China's response, which, as I mentioned before, I think was driven by the US response, but then China's response further frustrated the US and pushed it to up the ante. I mean, these press briefings about how this is an extensive surveillance program, impacted over 40 countries around the world, blah, blah, blah. I think that level of disclosure was driven by frustration with China's refusal to move from its original cover story, that this was just an innocent weather balloon. So yeah, I think that's the problem is where we are now, is how do you untangle this knot? And when both sides think that it's the other party's responsibility to make the first move, you get stuck in a situation where nobody does anything.
So Professor Dawei, do you have a question for the other 3 panelists?
Yeah, I have a very easy question, but because I haven't followed the information or the messages from India colleague very closely, so I'm curious about the general response from the ordinary people in India, and also the strategic elites' response to this incident. Where is India's position? It's in the middle or pro the or pro the US or pro China. I don't know where's your position. Anyone who can give me some understanding. Thank you.
Alka?
Maybe you could answer that. Well, on the whole, Professor Dawei, I have not seen any pro-China article or any kind of sentiment that would, but neither have I seen anything which is absolutely taking the American position as the correct one. There are concerns about China's behavior generally, and that is subsumed in the larger context of how we see China actually being a very difficult country to negotiate with or to come to an understanding with about contentious issues. So it comes within that, and there have been by and large general articles about this problem. So it's more about Sino-American relations. I don't see the strategic community in this country taking sides, but there are a few hawkish pieces which do suggest that the Chinese are now becoming a very big power and now entering into these kinds of games of big powers.
Okay, I mean, just to add to Alka's reply to Professor Dawei's question, and I mean, my reply to that is also a question to Shannon. And my reply and question is that, of course, as Alka said, there are a few hawkish pieces here and there, what we see in the Indian, among the Indian commentators. But a very serious and thoughtful response also coming from some very senior experienced diplomats and strategic thinkers is that, I mean, going by the nature of this incident, whether you call it accident or whether you call it incident or whether you call it, Chinese maneuver, whatever you call it, but the nature of the saga suggests that this could have been best left for the diplomats to settle, rather than make a hysteria out of it, etc., etc. So that's my question to you, Shannon, also, that, I mean, why the US media and the US administration, it seems hand in hand, created a hysteria to completely vilify China on this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things that's so frustrating about this incident is you can so easily envision an off-ramp that neither side was willing to take, right? If you imagine this is a balloon, we'll leave unstated what kind of balloon, but it comes from China. Beijing has admitted that it's being blown off course, which I think there's willingness in the United States to accept that as well. You just need someone in China's government to pick up the phone and call a US counterpart and say, hey, we lost control of a balloon. It looks like it may enter your airspace. Just a heads up. That didn't happen, apparently. We have no way of knowing whether or not it did, but it certainly doesn't seem like it did. So then I think the US overreacted to that, and we went down this cycle, which I won't repeat because I covered it in my introductory remarks. But something that is interesting to me is this incident takes place not just at an unfortunate time because of the Blinken visit, but also because China is in the middle of a government transition right now. And this is something I haven't seen mentioned very much in commentaries. Qin Gang is only a couple months into his tenure as foreign minister. We're going to have a new, turnover at the Ministry of Defense. The Central Military Commission has new faces on it as well. I think this may have been a case where people on the Chinese side are new to their jobs, not quite sure how to handle this incident, and people on the US side aren't quite sure who they should be talking to. And I think it's very telling that eventually the person Blinken talks to is not Qin Gang, the foreign minister, is Wang Yi, who was, of course, China's foreign minister for many, many years, very veteran diplomat, probably has the most connections to the United States of anyone in China's diplomatic corps right now. So I would love to hear Professor Dawei's thoughts on this, on how the still in process in some cases and fairly new in other cases, transition in China may have played into making this much worse than it needed to be.
Thank you, Shannon.
Yes,
Sorry, Professor Dawei. And after you, then I see Alka has raised her hand. So
may I just ask, okay, it is my second question and the last one to Professor Dawei, and he can go. So Professor Dawei, you basically brought your core argument really is that this is a structural kind of a issue, and that it is stemming from two factors. One is the narrowing gap between the two countries, and the next, the other one was divergent economic strategies. Now, the trajectory of both would actually continue to exacerbate the structural problem. So how do you see this ending? I mean, do you have a Thucydides trap kind of an end at the of it, or is it going to be some kind of a reconciliation at some level? But if it is a structural problem, how do you see it panning out?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let me try to answer Shannon's question first about the government transition. And first, I want to say that it's not China's culture to pick up the phone and dial to your counterpart in the US, say, hey, we made a mistake, I'm sorry. I think that's not our culture. We have never seen that before. So it's hard. And particularly in this very low trust situation, right, between the two countries, it's politically impossible. And for the transitional issue, I don't think the transition of our foreign policy team is a big challenge, because we have Wang Yi, we have Qin Gang. These two are, as you said, veteran diplomats, and they are very experienced, and they both of them worked in the foreign ministry for a very long time. So, but I think the different thing is the two sides connection is very, we lack this kind of connections now. For instance, the two embassies, the US embassies in Beijing and China's embassy in DC, cannot reach out very fully like in the past. We don't have an ambassador now in DC. Qin Gang was back, so we don't have an ambassador. And also, our embassy in the US very limited. Their outreach was limited very much. When Qin Gang was ambassador, he cannot meet any senior officials. He didn't meet any senior official. He didn't meet even governors, or sometimes mayor. Is very difficult. Of course, the US side has had similar complaints. They say they cannot meet Chinese local leader. They cannot meet China's ministers. So we lack those kind of communication channels now. So even if we have, veteran diplomats in both sides, I think that's not enough. We only have two people in China and Blinken or Sullivan in the US, 2+2. That's not enough. We need 100 plus 100. In the past, we have more than 100 mechanisms for dialogue, but now we have 0. And for Alka's question, I think, yes, we are continuing this kind of structural problems. And I think beyond this balloon issue, I think Taiwan and the technological war, I think, are two most critical issues, which I see, I think it will go on, particularly Taiwan issue. So it could be more difficult. I think, to some extent, I tend to say China and the US are already in the Cold War. But of course, this Cold War is different from the one between the Soviet Union and the US. But two major powers have, strategic confrontation, use all kinds of means with, of course, no military means, but try to compete or beat the other side. I think this is a Cold War, and today we don't have very clear nuclear balance or strategic stability between the two countries like Soviet Union and the US during the Cold War. So it could be even more dangerous than in the first Cold War. Now strategic stability issue becomes more sophisticated than 40 or 50 years ago. So it could be very dangerous. But of course, both sides express their view, their willingness try to avoid any hot war. But I think the possibility cannot be excluded. And I hope the two sides can seize the shorter window of opportunity this year. I mean, before the APEC or before the end of the war, end of the year, from maybe maybe June or July. I think the two sides still have chance to talk, and then set some floor. And we also need to watch who win the election in the U.S. next year. So that's another key factor. So if we can continue to work for that floor for 1 or 2 years, I think hopefully we can avoid any kind of hard war between the two countries. Then I'm satisfied. And then of course if we can maintain our social and some economic ties like trade, fair amount of trade and people to people ties, then I'm satisfied. Yeah, I think this is the best scenario I can imagine for short and mid run.
Well, it should hearten you that in 2022, record trade levels between the United States and China, surpassing earlier. So, I mean, that's the strange kind of. All right, thank you.
Thank you. I think we've had a very exciting 50 minutes of discussion, and we are now at the end of the second round. And let me conclude this second round on a very positive note, especially taking a cue from Professor Dawei, who has been very consistent in his opening round remarks also, and in replying to the questions also, that he still hopes very confidently that there is a window of hope. I mean, the window is fully open or not, that we have to see. But and also, as Shannon reflected, that the China's quick admittance, which is very unusual, was indicative of something which I think has been further strengthened by the statement recently given by, in the absence of the Chinese ambassador in the US, by the Chinese embassy's chargé d'affaires, Xu Xueyuan, who said that let the wandering balloon not astray the Sino-US relationship. And that is a reflection of some mindset in Beijing, that Beijing is not very keen to let the situation escalate into a point of no return. So with that, I come to the end of the second round, and I can see there have been many questions and raised hands. I would request my young colleague Nishant to help me from the chat box. But in the meantime, Ambassador Ashok Kanta had raised his hand early on. He has a couple of questions, and I would request Ambassador Kanta to make his intervention. Ambassador Kanta.
Thank you, Hemant. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Now, first, let me compliment all the panelists for excellent discussions we had so far. Talking about the balloon, personally, I believe that it's more a symptom rather than cause of present predicament or crisis in US-China relations. As both Shannon and Professor Dawei brought out, the initial position taken by both the USA and China was to sort of downplay the incident. But then domestic politics and other issues kicked in, and it has acquired a much higher profile. Let me turn to the underlying problems or structural problems, as Professor Dawei refers to. I was recently reading a very important and nuanced article by Professor Dawei, which has been widely circulated in China and outside. Professor Dawei makes the point that USA is determined to disconnect China from the global marketplace, and it's serious about decoupling. But the Chinese response needs to be balanced. There should not be any reactive decoupling on part of China, because China needs developed countries, including USA, for pursuing its rejuvenation goals. So, except core issues like Taiwan, on other issues, China needs to avoid a tit-for-tat response to various actions taken by USA. This is one, so I would request him to sort of elaborate on that. A very second point which he has made, which again is very important, borrowing from Mao Zedong's famous essay on contradiction, Professor Dawei suggests that the present competition with the USA is the primary contradiction, whereas the differences with America's, USA's allies are in the nature of secondary contradiction, and that USA needs to be more tolerant of these allies, including European countries, Japan, Australia, etc. I wanted to ask him that, again, what does he mean by tolerance? And whether, while we are not an ally of the USA, whether this tolerance extends to partner countries of USA like India, because we haven't so far seen any signs of any easing of Chinese position vis-a-vis India in respect to various issues raised by us. So there are two questions I wanted to pose to Professor Dawei. I had one question for Shannon, and this is recalling what Hemant said earlier, that we are not only in a Cold War, but moving towards a hot war. Presumably he's referring to the Taiwan issue and how it can go out of hand. I would like to have Shannon's views on that, because both Shannon and more so Professor Dawei seem to suggest that there's still room for stabilizing US-China relations. And personally, I also believe that we are not on the cusp of a war conflict, armed conflict between China and the USA on Taiwan at this point of time. Neither China nor USA is really interested in the military confrontation at this juncture.
Professor Dawei?
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Kanta, for this wonderful question, and thank you for reading my article. I didn't mention India in my article, not because India is not important. India, of course, extremely important, but because I want to focus my argument on developed world. I think I think for China, there are at least 5 blocks, 5 factors which are very important. That is the Europe, Russia, Northeast Asia, ASEAN country, and India. I think these 5 are extremely important and will decide the future of the competition between China and the US. But among those 5, I think Northeast Asia, that is Japan, Korea, and Europe, these are 2 developed world. So these 2 are developed world. So extremely important for China's technological development, and also China's supply chain. I think so. I focused on that, but I do believe that China should. First, I need to say I'm minority in China. So what I said, what I argued in the article is not only it's not Chinese government's policy, and I don't expect Chinese government will listen to me. But this is my, as a scholar, my personal view. But I do think we need to differentiate the U.S. from other countries, particularly the U.S. allies. For instance, Australia. Australia, we had a very difficult relations with Australia, because the Australian government and some politicians criticized China a lot about COVID and about Xinjiang. But for instance, if the US do the similar thing, and when US statesmen or politicians do the same thing I think China sometimes we have to fight back because they are aiming for the strategic competition with China. But I think Australia, Canada, and other European countries, they don't have this geopolitical conflict with China. So I think China can be or should be more tolerant. I think it applies to India. I think our contradiction with Russia, with India is at the second tier, so not our major one. So I hope that I think I'm a big advocate for a better China-India bilateral relations. I think that's extremely important for China and for India. So it's no reason for our two countries trapped in this bilateral, particularly those border issues. These two very promising developing countries, we should have a better relationship. But now it's hindering our development. I think it's shadowed our prospect for driving into a developed country. Not only for China, I think it's also true for India. So my argument is when, for instance, when the U.S. Working with allies like, so for example, South Korea on THAAD issue, I think China, if China believes that damage China's interest, I think China should punish the U.S. rather than South Korea, because we need to differentiate that the two actors. And actually, it's the United States want to deploy the THAAD system. So that's what I argued in my article, and I do believe that India is part of that. Though India is not a developed one, but developed country, but very important neighboring country of China. What is your? I'm sorry. What is your first question? I think I missed your first question, right?
I think you replied that tolerance.
Okay.
Sorry for my intervention here. Shannon, your reply to Ambassador Kanta's question?
Of course. I agree with Ambassador Kanta's position that neither China nor the US is intentionally moving us toward a hot war. Neither side wants to be engaged in a conflict with each other. I think both governments are well aware that that would be a disaster. What we have is a lot of defense buildup and posturing that is aimed at deterrence. It's actually aimed at preventing a conflict from taking place. The problem is that when you have increased military postures, increased military rhetoric, it increases the chances of an accident, right? And as we've said repeatedly throughout this discussion, the balloon incident was an accident. And so I think it's important in that it gives us a way to gauge how China and the US will handle an unexpected incident. And the answer, unfortunately, is not very well. We've talked before about the lack of direct communication mechanisms, the lack of trust, all colored how this was handled. At the end of the day, rather than really giving a good faith effort to de-escalate, both sides decided to use the balloon to their own advantage at the other country's expense. If you believe the US government that this was a surveillance balloon, maybe it wasn't intended to go over, Montana, but China decided to, well, it's already there. Let's just gather some additional data on US nuclear warhead storage sites. And meanwhile, the US used this to try to paint China in the worst possible lights, releasing all of these incredibly embarrassing accusations about mass surveillance programs, not just over the US, but over other countries. So what concerns me is the potential for an inadvertent incident that kind of forces both countries into a conflict, hopefully not a full-scale war. But I think we all remember the 2001 incidents involving a US spy plane that collided with a Chinese fighter jet near Hainan Island. And if we imagine, how would that play out today, given what we've seen about crisis management over this balloon incident? And what worries me is there's been a growing number of such encounters. The US military is now taking journalists along on these flights in an attempt to shame China for its behavior during these intercepts, which I think is very problematic. But the potential for an accident is there, right? These aircraft are operating in close proximity to each other in these flashpoints. And so for me, that's what is worrying, is not that, there's going to be a conscious decision made. Someone's going to wake up and say, today I'm going to war with China or with the United States. But just that the lack of trust between the two sides and the absence of reliable communication mechanisms could put us in a situation where an accident kind of forces us down this runaway chain of consequences that could lead to a hot war in the worst possible scenario.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Kanta, Dawei, and Shannon for these questions and answers. Now I see one raised hand. I think I will go to that and then request my young colleague Nishant to maybe read out the questions from the chat box. So Shubhadeep.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Sir, thank you for this esteemed discussion that we had. I have two questions. I will start with the one that has started, as Shannon mentioned. Ms. Shannon mentioned that the US took a long time to respond to the balloon until and unless the public started to react on the social media and on that. So why Biden administration took this time to gain any political brownie or something? And if so, do you think that has a political that gave a political leverage to Biden? And continuing to that extent, the Canada also had to shoot down one of the balloon on their the airspace. So do you think there is also a connection in terms of the political implication and the reaction? And my second question is that to shot down a balloon, the US administration used F-21. So what if the knowledge that I have is that the same thing can be done by a drone. So why to it will utilize such a massive force? Is it to showcase or political strategy, if that can be highlighted? Yeah, thank you. So these are two questions.
Okay, I will start with your second question, which unfortunately I can't answer very well because I am not an expert in military technology. I do know there was actually a lot of debate within the US defense community about whether the US could shoot down the balloon, because these are not the sorts of targets that fighter jets or armed drones are used to shooting at. They don't appear on radar screens in the same way. Again, there's lots of technical details that I'm not extremely sure about. But it may have been that they did need to use a fighter jet because of the altitude that the balloon was at, and they may have needed an actual person to fix the targeting. But again, I'm not very confident on that. So, but I think that does complicate the political narrative at play in that decision, because there may have been actual, reasons for doing it that were just technical. As for the timing of the response, as I said, I think my reading was that the Biden administration was kind of hoping they wouldn't have to say anything at all about this because the balloon entered US airspace over Alaska, which is a very sparsely populated US state. I don't think anyone noticed it other than the US military says it was tracking it at the time. And then it drifted over into Canada. And at that point, no one really knows where it's going to go. So I think the Biden administration might have thought, we don't need to do anything about this. The balloon's no longer in our airspace. We can just ignore it. Unfortunately, it then dipped south into Montana and it ended up transiting most of the continental United States. And at that point, I think they had to start issuing statements, very forceful statements. They were very defensive. Lots of people were, including US representatives and senators from the states that the balloon was transiting, were very angrily asking why it hadn't been shot down earlier off the coast of Alaska. And so I think that is what really forced the Biden administration's hand to say, well, everyone wants us to shoot this thing down. Now we're going to shoot it down. And as you noted, they made sure to do that within US territorial waters because they wanted to gather up the parts of the balloon. And there's lots of legal vagaries in international law over whether they are actually allowed to do that. But by making sure that it did land within US territorial waters, they strengthened their case that that was something that they could do.
Thank you, Shannon. I mean, just a quick comment from my side. I mean, of course, I'm also not still learning about what experts are saying, the military technology or experts are saying, but I'm sorry to say that they're actually leaving us confused because we are getting contradictory statements from one group of such experts saying something else, and there is another group which is saying something else about the whether surveillance or spying or whether it could be maneuvered or not, etc., etc. So at least I am confused. I am not getting any clear picture from the military technology or military experts on that. With that, Shubhadeep Mondal, my young colleague in ICS, thankfully has reminded me that there are questions on the YouTube, also those who are watching it on the YouTube. So I'll request that let us have one question from the chat box here and one question from the YouTube in that order. So Nishant, please.
Sure, sir. I'll start off with Ambassador Kishan Rana's comments. He offers to pose a few contrarian views to what has been set out in the opening statement. He has posed 3 comments. First one, far from worsening, the China-US relationship may be easing, shown via small signals. The new Chinese foreign minister is thought to be easier in his approach. Second, I find the mouse-elephant analogy used by the chair rather odd. In some ways, this mouse has a higher throw weight than the US, especially in the regions proximate to China. Third, behind the ballet of sanctions, some via media is also hinted at in contrarian fashion. Overall, let's not be guided by headlines. By the way, I do agree with Shannon. So these are the comments from Ambassador Rana.
Okay. I mean, I just want to clarify that what I said about mouse and elephant, that was not my opinion. I just said that is what, at least on Chinese WeChat, there's some discussions are commenting like that. That's all.
Sure. So now a question from YouTube by Jaideep Gadvi. Deputy Secretary Sherman, in a meeting with representatives of various countries, including India, alluded that such actions would have been carried out against India, probably in Andamans. Any thoughts?
To whom is this question addressed?
It is not indicated. So, yeah.
So,
I can chime in on
Yeah,
the elephant
please.
and mouse question, because I think this really gets at something that's at the heart of the US-China competition, which is that we are talking about a conflict in China's near theater, right? Most people talk about Taiwan. Sometimes the South China Sea comes up as a potential venue for a hot war. And I think from the Chinese perspective, that is the key, right? This is the US coming over to China's near abroad to fight a war. So as you noted, China is quite militarily strong in these regions. It's not an elephant and a mouse contest. But I think what Chinese analysts are trying to get at with this is that China doesn't directly threaten the United States. I think there's basically zero fear of China mounting an invasion of US territories. That's just not really within the realm of possibility. So I think that's more the dynamic of what it's trying to get at, is that China does not pose a direct threat to the United States. So why is Washington so worried about this?
Thank you, Shannon.
And also, I also want to chime in following what Shannon said. And one of the reasons some Chinese experts or officials are the reason behind their reluctance for crisis management measures with the US side is basically what this kind of crisis management measures are preventing conflicts and accidents in air or sea near China, not somewhere in the Pacific or somewhere near the United States. So China believes that the US ships and airplane are damaging China's interest in doing surveillance every day in the in the waters or airspace which is very close to China. So if we have that kind of crisis management measures, that means US can damage China's interest safely. So why should we do that? I'm not saying I agree with them, but I think this is the mindset of many Chinese people here.
Okay, thank you. Nishant, next question, please.
Yes, the next question on Zoom chat is from Khwaish Kumawat. She asks, with respect to the balloon saga, I wish to know how it will impact the worsening relations of US and China that are already strained by US support of Taiwan and trade frictions. This question is for Ms. Shannon and Professor Dawei.
I think that's really what we've been talking about this whole time is
Yes, exactly.
What is the impact of this going to be? So on one hand, the impact is not very much. As Professor Dawei and Alka mentioned, ties are already very strained. As Alka was telling us, there wasn't really much prospect for a huge breakthrough in Blinken's visit, even if it had happened. So, maybe we didn't really lose that much from the balloon. But I think if you look at it from a different angle, it is costly. Certainly, I think in the United States, it has amplified what we call the China threat theory. Because as I said, there isn't really a sense that China directly threatens the US, but then all of a sudden, you have average Americans looking up in the sky and seeing a balloon that they've been told is China spying on them. I think it caused a lot of people in the United States to think very negatively about China and to have this sense that China is directly threatening them. So in that sense, I think the long-term implications could be concerning. I also realized we didn't really talk much about the balloons over India, which I think this is part of the US strategy of handling this incident is to make it not just a China-US bilateral accident, but to raise suspicions that China has been doing this to many other countries, not just India, but also Japan, the United Kingdom, obviously Latin America. There is a balloon transiting that region at the same time. So now it's up to all of these other governments to decide how they want to respond. The Indian government, I think, I'm not as up on this discussion as probably Hemans is, but I think has been fairly muted in its response. Japan has been as well. It's a little more debate in the United Kingdom. So we'll have to see if this becomes not just a bilateral incident, but a multilateral one moving forward.
Yeah, I have not seen any official or any strategic thinker really commenting or reacting to what if the Chinese balloons are spotted over Indian airspace or India. But Japan definitely recently, I think, has issued a statement that if something like this happens in Japan, then Japan will also shoot it down. Now, I leave it at that, and maybe we can request Professor Dawei to respond to the same question because it was addressed to him as well.
Yeah, but actually, I don't have much more to add. As Shannon said, we already discussed it a lot. I think for the longer term, it could be remembered as something from our perspective. It's something like we have similar things in the past. It's something like Pelosi's visit last year. I mentioned that it's to some extent it's quite similar. In last year in China, that the visit, all the ordinary Chinese follow the incident, follow her visit from before her takeoff. Then they have lively broadcast. Where is she? When will she enter the airspace of Taiwan, and when did she landed, and how? For 2 or 3 days, everybody follows that. I think the number I got was more than 300 million people watch the video of her landing Taiwan. I think those cases are a part of the politicization or securitization of the two countries. So China-US relations, we had, of course, we had tensions before 2017, before Trump took the office. But actually, I think President Trump and his advisor raised this concept, raised this mindset about China as the most important strategic competitor. So at that time, it's still among some senior politicians and advisors in Washington, D.C. Then that kind of perception enlarged in past year through like trade war, then COVID, and then the Ukraine war. And this time it reached to the ordinary people level. So almost this case, I think, is part of this securitization process or politicization process, and from the top to the bottom. Now it's reached the grassroots level. I think this is the role this incident played in the U.S. And I think the case of Pelosi's visit to Taiwan played a similar role here in China last year. So the two countries, I think, have been fully mobilized and to view the other side as a hostile competitor. I think, of course, that's bad. That's very bad for the bilateral relations. But again, I don't think it's a structural issue.
I think after hearing Professor Dawei just now on the two countries have been mobilized, I mean, in a lighter tone and maybe in hindsight, metaphorically, of course, perhaps the way the hysteria was created or noticed in the reactions of the people in China during Pelosi's visit, perhaps we can now, in a lighter tone, can say that, I mean, Pelosi was the American balloon coming over to China.
But this balloon, I think that balloon can really be steered. While our balloon, really, we cannot control it.
Okay. Next question, please.
Yes, sir. We have around 8 to 10 minutes left, so I would like to take around 2 questions together, if that's fine. First one, again from YouTube. The handle is that guy from Arunachal. The question is, I have been hearing the guest speaker use the word overreaction quite a bit regarding the shooting down of the balloon, but isn't sending your equipment into the airspace of another nation without permission a serious violation of international practice? A second question from Zoom chat from Rohil Vaidya. If both the US and China are willing to turn towards a more acrimonious relationship and used Balloon Gate to materialize this impulse, can we expect more bouts of trade war? If interdependence was considered the limiting factor for inflamed Sino-US relations, how does that reasoning change? Is legitimizing a narrative of potential kinetic action against Taiwan that important to China? So these are the two questions.
I think Professor Dawei can respond to these questions.
Yeah, first of all, I think, yeah, of course, I think China already offered apology for the US side for, entering the US airspace. Of course, that's not good. We admit that. We feel sorry about that. But we say it's overreact because we believe we could have there could be other way to handle it. It could be better. Yeah, of course, the US have the right to shoot it down. We can say that. Of course, it's in the US airspace. But is there any better way that we can handle that? Just like, for instance, let me drag India into that. For instance, between China and India, we have border dispute. Yeah, unfortunately, we have that dispute, and there are some clashes. There are disputes there, but I think we each side try to control the level of the militarization of this border. I think that's a good thing. That's a good thing. Or we may have major war. There are already some unfortunate incidents happened between our two countries, but we still try to avoid war. You can say, hey, you entered my territory, I can launch a war to attack you. Or the US send their surveillance aircraft to China. Sometimes they entered China's, for instance, in 2001, the EP-3 landed in Hainan without permission of Chinese government. And they also actually one Chinese pilot killed, right? they landed in China's territory. So could we arrest them forever, and maybe we can shoot down them, we can kill them? I think there are always some good and better way to handle it, to cool down the situation. So that's the way. That's the reason we say overreaction, I think. The second question, I don't know what is the real question here. I think this balloon issue, I think it's not. I don't think it's related very directly to other issues like trade war or economic interdependence. I think, of course, we have problem with or Taiwan. I think China and the U.S. have long time dispute over those trade interdependence or Taiwan. But I don't want to say this issue has any direct impact on those specific issues. So I don't think it will bring more trade war or it will lead China to increase its military actions over to Taiwan. I think it's not this kind of direct link between those issues.
Thank you, sir. I think Dr. Aram Ashraf has raised her hand. So would you like to go, ma'am? All right. I think the security settings are. I think now you will be able to unmute yourself, ma'am. Please try. All right. Yeah.
You hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, thank you very much. So thank you to ICS for organizing this event, because to be honest, I've learned a lot from people, especially like Shannon Tiezzi. So my concern was initially, why has this whole episode even come out in the way it did? And to be honest, I now realize that it was the civilian side that started spotting the balloons, and which put the pressure on the government to come out with it. So thank you for clarifying that. But then hearing Professor Dawei talk about, well, China doesn't come out and apologize straight away, and there's no telephone to say that, oh, we are coming. That concerns me, because it concerns me in the sense that if an incident like this is to happen, what are the mechanisms to ensure that they don't escalate, as I think it's been mentioned before? And here I'm thinking again, the Bay of Pigs, Cuba, John F. Kennedy, that time period of Cold War, where the incident then led to the hotline being developed. So do you think going forward, this incident should be a wake-up call, and perhaps the two countries should have some mechanism set up where these things don't, pardon my pun, but they don't blow up in everybody's face the way this balloon saga has come forward? So I'd like to hear everybody's view on this. Thank you very much.
May I now?
Yeah.
Yes. I think actually I studied China-U.S. relations for more than 2 decades. So that kind of question were asked after the bombing of Chinese embassy in Belgrade, after the EP3 incident in 2001, and after other crises between our two countries. But we still don't have that kind of crisis management mechanism. We do have some hotlines, but that's not the real hotline, because when crisis happened, it's not being very effective. I think one of the mechanism maybe we can work out maybe in the coming months. I mean, if we have that opportunity, I'm not sure, but if we have that opportunity, I think it's possible that we at certain level, for instance, national security advisor to Chinese, for instance, to Wang Yi, somewhat at that level. I mean, not at presidential level, because at presidential level it's too political, but still a very senior level and close enough to the presidents. I think at that level, maybe we can set up some real hotlines that no matter what happened and whenever what time is it, if the ring rung, then you can pick up the phone and have direct dialogue. I think that's something maybe we can work out. I hope that the two sides should should discuss in the coming months. But of course, I don't know if that will happen, and I don't know if we have that window of opportunity in the coming months. But it's urgently needed, I think, between the two countries.
Thank you, sir. I think we are running short of time now, but just so that the remaining 3 questions don't fall in oblivion, I would just like to read them just as an acknowledgement. So there was one question from Rappai Maliakal sir. He asked how significant China policy is in US domestic politics. There were 2 questions from Ishita Rudra. The first question was on the Taiwan issue after Nancy Pelosi's visit, how China views on the prospect of unification of Taiwan issue. Her second question was how China intends to use its global security initiative in context of Middle East. So these were some questions. Professor Hemant, should we wind this up or should we?
I think we have consumed the time allotted for this discussion, and we had great discussion. And my apologies to all those participants whose questions could not be answered. But with the promise that the questions and the range of questions which were generated, I think we will try and request and then arrange for a separate individual talks by Shannon as well as Professor Dawei in the near future and maybe soon. With those words, I thank you all, especially our guest speakers and the participants. Thank you so much.
So with this, our Wednesday seminar comes to an end. We had a very rich and insightful panel discussion today. On behalf of Institute of Chinese Studies, my heartfelt thanks to all the panelists, the moderator, and the wonderful participants who raised some really interesting questions. The recording of this Wednesday seminar will be available on our ICS YouTube channel. We organize Wednesday seminars every week, and you will find the next notification soon on our social media channels. Once again, thank you all for participating and engaging. Wish you have a good evening, good day. Thank you.
Bye-bye, Dawei, Shannon. Bye-bye. Bye-bye,
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.